Stop. If you think you know true crime, you are wrong. Forget the well-trodden streets of Victorian Whitechapel. Forget the famous names, the sensational headlines, and the endless academic debates. Because in the heart of 1930s America, a decade drowning in the misery of the Great Depression, a killer was operating with a savagery that dwarfed Jack the Ripper. This monster's hunting ground wasn't a gaslit alley. It was the gleaming, desperate industrial promise of Cleveland, Ohio. And the only man who could stop him, the legendary federal agent who brought down Al Capone, was about to face the one fight he would never win. The day started like any other for the two teenage boys cutting through Kingsbury Run, a sprawling, sewage-choked gulch that sliced through the city's industrial core. It was a place of shadows, rail lines, and the ramshackle Hoovervilles where the working poor and forgotten men, the vagrants, the drifters, the men history had left behind, made their home. They were looking for scrap metal, but what they found would haunt a nation for decades. It was a body. Two bodies, in fact. They were side by side, half submerged in the fetid muck of the creek bed. The sight of a dead man was not entirely uncommon in Kingsbury Run, but the gruesome condition of these corpses was unlike anything any veteran police officer had ever seen. Both victims were men, their skin slick and pale, but they were not simply dead. They were torsos. They had been professionally and meticulously decapitated. The heads were gone. The killer hadn't just severed the head, he had stripped the entire body of any identifying mark. Even more horrifying, he had drained the bodies of blood, using an obscure technique that suggested a chilling expertise in human anatomy. The flesh of the first man, later identified by fingerprints as a young orderly named Edward Andrassy, was remarkably clean, almost bleached, as if the entire torso had been carefully bathed. The message was clear. This was not a crime of passion. This was an act of calculated, ritualistic butchery. The city tried to look away. The victims were just bums, the press muttered, no one important. The Great Depression had hardened Cleveland. It was a city of nearly 1 million people, a hub of steel and industry, choked by unemployment, fear, and the lingering corruption of Prohibition's end. This horror was relegated to the back pages, the kind of cheap, sensational filler one tossed aside with the comics. But the police saw the terrible truth. A cold, surgical intelligence was loose in the city. The torso killer had arrived, and this was only the beginning of a reign of terror that would soon touch every corner of Cleveland, shatter the career of a national hero, and leave behind an official victim count of 12, and a true legacy of perhaps double that number, all without ever being caught. To understand the terror, you must first understand the time and the place. Cleveland in 1935 was a city of stark, cruel contrasts. Downtown, the magnificent Union Terminal gleamed, a testament to American progress. But just a few blocks away, in the industrial valley known as the Flats, lay Kingsbury Run. Kingsbury Run was a scar on the city's soul, a network of forgotten ravines, abandoned shanties, and railway tracks, a sanctuary for the desperate. These Hoovervilles were populated by the very type of people the torso killer targeted: the marginalized, the homeless, the working poor, for whom the American dream had become a waking nightmare. No one missed them. No one asked questions. This environment provided the killer with both an endless supply of victims and the perfect, isolated dumping ground. For months, the city held its breath, hoping the first two bodies were an anomaly. Then, in January 1936, the killer struck again. But this time, he was bolder. The remains of a woman later identified by fingerprints as Florence Polillo, a local restaurant worker, were discovered in the heart of the city, a short walk from City Hall and the bright lights of the theater district. Her body was also dismembered, but this time the pieces were neatly wrapped in burlap sacks and dumped behind a tailor shop. It was a calculated escalation, a move from the shadows of Kingsbury Run into the public square. This time, the victim had a name, a life, and a face the newspapers could plaster on the front page. The fear was now palpable. The killer wasn't just preying on the unseen, he was announcing his presence to the world. And Cleveland, a city trying to project an image of stability and recovery, suddenly had a much bigger problem than the Depression. In late 1935, a national hero arrived in Cleveland. His name was Eliot Ness. Ness wasn't just a police official, he was a legend. As the man who, with his incorruptible untouchables, had successfully fought Al Capone in Chicago, he was the living symbol of law and order. Cleveland's Mayor Harold Burton hired Ness as the city's director of public safety to clean up the notoriously corrupt police department. He was the city's last best hope. Ness was a modern man, a believer in science and clean governance. He saw the torso killer as a problem of order, of evidence, a puzzle to be solved with logic. He threw his full resources at the case, including his best detective, the relentlessly determined Peter Merylo, who would spend years chasing the shadow of the killer, often going undercover among the vagrants in Kingsbury Run to understand the killer's environment. But even for Eliot Ness, the torso killer was different. This wasn't organized crime. This was a single, elusive monster whose motives defied easy explanation. A shadowy figure who knew how to torture and dissect a body like a surgeon, then vanish like smoke. Eliot Ness's reputation was about to be put to the ultimate test. The official count of the Cleveland torso murders is generally 12 victims, 7 men and 5 women, killed between 1935 and 1938, though some investigators believe the spree may have begun earlier and lasted longer. The killer's horrifying modus operandi, or MO, was his signature, the grisly calling card that bound the murders together: decapitation. Every victim was decapitated. In almost all cases, the head was never found, or was found placed at a significant distance from the body. Dismemberment and disarticulation. The killer expertly dismembered the bodies, often severing the arms and legs at the joints, a level of skill that led police to suspect a doctor, butcher, or surgeon. Chemical treatment. Some remains, notably Victim 1, showed evidence of having been treated with a chemical preservative, suggesting the killer may have kept the body for some time before dumping it. Absence of blood. The bodies were systematically drained of blood, a procedure requiring not only anatomical knowledge, but also time and a secure location. The torso killer was taunting them. He was not only committing the perfect crime, he was proving his professional mastery over human flesh right under the nose of America's greatest lawman. In June 1936, the horror returned to Kingsbury Run. Victim 4, a man nicknamed the Tattooed Man, was found. His headless torso was discovered near the East 55th Street Bridge, and the following day, his head was found wrapped in trousers nearby. This was the first time a head was recovered, but the decomposition made identification impossible. For the next 2 years, the bodies piled up, each one a testament to the killer's brazen confidence. A pair of victims dumped practically in front of the Nickel Plate Railroad police building. 2 bodies discovered right under the Lorraine-Carnegie Bridge, almost within sight of Eliot Ness's own City Hall office. The city of Cleveland was holding the Great Lakes Exposition, a shining display of American resilience and prosperity, but the torso killer was providing the macabre, unofficial sideshow. The killer was literally parading his victims in the city's most public spaces, daring Eliot Ness to catch him. The pressure became unbearable. The question of who the killer was and why Ness couldn't stop him dominated every newspaper. The arrival of spring in 1936 brought no warmth to Cleveland. The air was cold and heavy with fear. The torso killer was accelerating his pace, and with it, the panic among the populace. Front-page headlines screamed about body parts and the police's evident failure to catch the killer. It was into this crucible that Eliot Ness was thrown, his legendary status now under siege. In June, the 4th victim was found, known only as the Tattooed Man. This case was unique because the victim, whose head and hands were severed, bore 6 distinct tattoos, including the names Helen and Paul. These tattoos were the last hope for identification. Coincidentally, Cleveland was preparing to host the Great Lakes Exposition to celebrate its centennial and showcase American resilience during the Depression. Ness took a desperate, controversial step. He arranged for a plaster cast of the tattooed man's head and a chart of his tattoos to be displayed at the exposition. The backlash. The idea was to have hundreds of thousands of visitors potentially identify the victim. The result was catastrophic. No identification was made, and the killer's brutality became an international spectacle. Ness had sought publicity, but he received condemnation. Dr. A.J. Pierce, the coroner, confirmed that the nature of the cuts, the professional dissection, and the use of chemical preservatives definitively proved the work of a single killer. He dubbed the killer the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, a name that stuck. Ness realized that traditional policing was failing. He needed to resort to the aggressive, psychological tactics he had used against Capone. As the summer and fall of 1936 arrived, the killer's operational radius expanded. The victim's remains began turning up in the Cuyahoga River, much closer to the heart of the city. This signaled a frightening escalation. The killer grew bolder, and the body count grew rapidly. July 1936, victim number 5, a man's head and torso found in an open lot. September 1936. In this case, the killer seemingly stopped trying to hide the blood, and a section of the body was deliberately left near the river. Coroner Pierce noted that the killer was acting as if he was challenging the police. A particularly disturbing signature emerged on the male victims, notably Edward Andrassy and the Tattooed Man: deliberate emasculation. This specific mutilation offered a grim psychological insight. It suggested a deep-seated sexual or power-related pathology. The killer likely harbored a profound resentment toward symbols of masculinity or authority, projecting his own rage or inadequacy onto the victims. The citizens of Cleveland weren't just witnessing murder.
They were seeing the grotesque rampage of a mentally disturbed criminal whose pathology was too elusive for the police to contain. Ness's reputation as the untouchable was rapidly unraveling.
While Eliot Ness was the public face of the investigation, Lieutenant Peter Metalolo was the unsung, tenacious detective who carried the weight of the street-level investigation for years. Metalolo quickly realized that the killer preyed on the transient population, using the railways that crisscrossed Kingsbury Run. He spent 6 years chasing the case, going undercover to blend in with the homeless and the railroad workers across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. He became convinced that the killer was a mobile entity, likely moving by train or along the industrial highways connecting the cities. It was Metalolo who first connected the dots between the Cleveland murders and similar torso murders occurring in Youngstown and Pittsburgh. He understood this was not just a local crisis, but a problem spanning the industrial tri-state area. While Ness focused on political maneuvering and public relations, Metalolo's work was a testament to silent, grueling dedication. His ultimate failure to catch the killer, despite his years of deep, personal sacrifice, stands in sharp contrast to Ness's more theatrical but equally unsuccessful approach.
In the midst of the chaos and Eliot Ness's failing grip on the torso case, the sheriff's department, rivals of the city police, made a desperate, catastrophic move. In July 1939, almost a year after the last official murder, Sheriff Martin O'Donnell arrested a 52-year-old bricklayer named Frank Dolezal. Dolezal was an alcoholic drifter who knew several of the victims, including Florence Polillo, victim number 3, and Edward Andrassy, victim number 2. He had worked in a slaughterhouse, which police seized upon as proof of his anatomical knowledge. The evidence was flimsy, but the pressure to deliver a killer was immense. Dolezal was brutally interrogated by the sheriff's deputies. After days in custody, he allegedly confessed to killing Florence Polillo. However, he quickly recanted, claiming his confession was beaten out of him. Reporters who saw Dolezal in jail noted a visible black eye and other signs of physical abuse. Dolezal claimed the deputies threatened to hang him. Despite the obvious signs of coercion, the court proceeded with the charge. The tragic end. On August 24, 1939, before he could appear before the grand jury, Frank Dolezal was found dead in his county jail cell, hanged from a piece of cloth. The official ruling was suicide. However, forensic analysis and later research, including the work of historian James Jesson Badal, cast grave doubt on this verdict. The mark on Dolezal's neck was reportedly too deep to be consistent with the soft cloth he allegedly used. Many believe Dolezal was murdered by those who feared he would expose the truth about his coerced confession and the police brutality involved. The death of Frank Dolezal achieved two things. It provided a false sense of closure for the public, and it served as a dark, permanent stain on the Cleveland justice system. Eliot Ness, who never believed Dolezal was the torso killer, was utterly powerless to intervene in the sheriff's jurisdiction, adding yet another layer of defeat to his Cleveland legacy.
Facing overwhelming public and political pressure, Ness knew he had to act decisively, even if it meant abandoning the rule of law he had always championed. By August 1938, after the discovery of the final 2 official victims, Ness believed he knew the killer's lair, the maze of shantytowns in Kingsbury Run. If he couldn't catch the monster, he would destroy his habitat. On August 16, 1938, Ness ordered his officers to raid the Hooverville community in Kingsbury Run, the homes of hundreds of poor and desperate transients. Using bulldozers and fire, Ness's men methodically burned the entire settlement to the ground. Ness's rationale? He argued that the shacks were the killer's hunting and processing grounds, and destroying them would eliminate his operational base. The fires achieved a grim result. The murders in Cleveland immediately stopped. Ness had physically removed the killer's environment, forcing him to leave or go dormant. However, The act was a catastrophic public relations and moral defeat. Ness was condemned for destroying the meager homes of the poor and, more critically, for likely destroying any remaining forensic evidence of the killer's presence. This final desperate act shattered his image as the incorruptible hero.
With the Kingsbury Run fires and the commitment of Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, Ness's prime suspect, to a mental institution, Ness finally achieved a form of resolution. The killings stopped. But Sweeney was not done fighting. While institutionalized, he began sending a series of bizarre and chilling taunting postcards directly to Eliot Ness at City Hall. The content. The postcards contained dark, cryptic poetry, mocking comments about Ness's failure, and sinister clues about the murders. The psychological war. Ness never publicly disclosed these postcards. He knew they proved that he had identified the killer, yet still failed to secure an indictment. Sweeney's correspondence was a final act of psychological torture. The killer was defeated, but still alive, relentlessly proving his intellectual victory over the famed lawman. This hidden exchange cemented the deep, personal humiliation of Ness. He had forced the killer into isolation, but could not bring him to justice, a failure that would eventually destroy his career and his personal life.
The fires of Kingsbury Run had cooled to ash. The bodies had stopped appearing. The official investigation died. Not with a bang, but with a defeated, drawn-out whimper. Yet, for Eliot Ness, the hunt was not over. In the darkest corners of his City Hall office, away from the glare of the press and the political machinations of the police department, the legendary lawman kept a single, tightly guarded secret. He knew the killer's name. The name was Dr. Francis E. Sweeney. Dr. Sweeney was the antithesis of the vagrant victims. He was a wealthy, highly educated man from one of Cleveland's most prominent families. He was a former military doctor who had served in a medical unit during World War I and later worked at the Cryo Clinic, a prestigious medical facility. His training gave him the exact, intimate knowledge of human anatomy that the torso killer consistently demonstrated. He could dissect a body with a precision that bordered on surgical art. The connection was established through Dr. Arthur F. Geraci, a young police doctor who assisted in the autopsies. Geraci had been a former protege of Sweeney's. During a crucial moment in the investigation, Geraci reportedly pointed Ness toward Sweeney, suggesting that no one else in Cleveland possessed the specific, unusual skills required to drain and section the bodies in that manner. The evidence against Sweeney was circumstantial, but chillingly comprehensive. Anatomical skill. His medical training matched the killer's MO perfectly. The clean dismemberment at the joints spoke of professional knowledge, access, and mobility. As a respected physician, he had the mobility, the financial resources, and the necessary isolation, a secure, private location, perhaps a lab or a separate residence, to hold and process the bodies without suspicion. Proximity. Sweeney lived and worked in areas close to where several victims were found, including one dump site right off the East 55th Street Bridge. Mental state. Crucially, Sweeney was, at various times, an inpatient at various Veterans Administration hospitals, struggling with severe mental illness, including alcoholism
and bouts of violent paranoia. This fits the profile of a killer driven by inner demons and a profound need for control. Eliot Ness and his top detectives could never get enough hard evidence to secure an arrest warrant. There were no witnesses to the crimes, no usable fingerprints, no heads, and therefore no dental records to link a victim directly to Sweeney. But Ness didn't give up. He used his untouchable tactics in a secret, psychological campaign of attrition, starting in 1938 and continuing for several years. Ness brought Sweeney in for what amounted to relentless, non-official interrogations. These were not polite conversations. They were hours-long, grinding sessions designed to break the killer's composure. Sweeney, a man of high intelligence and arrogance, matched Ness's intensity. He never broke. He reportedly boasted about the murders, dropped chillingly specific details only the killer could know, and even taunted the legendary agent. The killer showed contempt for the authorities. He had a definite feeling of superiority. He was daring us to catch him, Ness would later recall, speaking in coded language about Sweeney. It was a battle of wills between the man who hunted criminals and the man who became one. Sweeney understood his rights, understood the lack of concrete evidence, and reveled in the fact that he was untouchable, even by the untouchable himself. Frustrated but certain, Ness orchestrated a permanent covert surveillance operation against Sweeney. He had his men follow the doctor relentlessly. The surveillance was so effective that Sweeney became convinced the police were trying to frame him. His paranoia intensified, and he began writing strange, threatening letters to Ness and the police, a classic serial killer pattern of reaching out to the authorities. Eventually, Sweeney's family, attempting to contain his erratic and violent behavior, had him committed to a state psychiatric institution. The torso murders in Cleveland stopped the day after his committal. For Eliot Ness, this was his vindication. He had forced the killer off the street, even if he couldn't deliver him to the electric chair. For the public, the case simply went cold, a tragic failure for the hero of the city. The irony was devastating. The man who stood up to Al Capone, the symbol of American justice, was powerless against a single, demented physician, a man who understood the fine line between the mind's brilliance and its madness.
Eliot Ness's investigation was not simply a street-level search. It was a psychological duel. The moment Dr. Francis E. Sweeney was identified as the prime suspect, the hunt for the torso killer transformed from a police procedural into an intense covert game of cat and mouse. Ness was convinced Sweeney was his man, but suspicion was not enough for a conviction. Ness knew he couldn't get a legal warrant due to the lack of heads, fingerprints, or a murder weapon, so he resorted to tactics outside the official playbook, using his authority to bring Sweeney in for a series of secret interrogations. These were not standard police interviews. They were psychological warfare designed to break the suspect. During these sessions, Sweeney, a brilliant and highly educated man battling alcoholism and paranoid schizophrenia, would reportedly toy with Ness. Taunting clues. Sweeney allegedly dropped highly specific, chilling details about the murders that only the killer would know. He described the process, the isolation, and his intellectual contempt for the police's inability to connect the dots. The boast. Sweeney was said to have boasted about his proficiency, seemingly relishing the fact that he was proving his superior intellect to the great Eliot Ness. He understood that in the absence of a corpus delicti, the body of the crime,
or specifically the head, he was legally untouchable. The legal system was designed to protect individuals, and Sweeney knew exactly where the lines were drawn. The key failures were no direct evidence. There was no physical link, DNA was decades away, between Sweeney and the dismembered remains. No confession under law. Sweeney never signed a confession. Any incriminating statements he made were often contradictory or uttered while in a state of severe mental distress, rendering them inadmissible in court. Political interference. Sweeney came from a prominent Cleveland family. Any attempt by Ness to arrest him without irrefutable evidence would have resulted in an immediate political backlash and the end of Ness's career. Ness's only recourse was the psychological pressure that ultimately drove Sweeney's family to have him committed to a VA hospital. Ness may have forced the killer off the street, but his failure to secure an arrest meant the hero of the city had been beaten by a madman.
The official record closes the book on the Cleveland torso killer in 1938, with 12 victims and no arrests. But the most terrifying aspect of the case is the strong suspicion among police and investigative historians that the Mad Butcher was not confined to Kingsbury Run. The specific surgical nature of the dismemberments, the signature MO, appeared in other cities along the same industrial corridor, Youngstown, Ohio, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Did the torso killer simply stop after Eliot Ness burned the shanty towns and Dr. Francis E. Sweeney was institutionalized? Or did he move his hunting grounds? The timeline of the torso killer may have begun before the official 1935 start date. In September 1934, a headless torso of a woman was discovered washed up on the shores of Lake Erie near Cleveland's Euclid Beach. She was known only as the Lady of the Lake. Her remains were prepared with the same unnerving precision, the head and limbs severed cleanly, the body drained. The case was initially treated as an isolated incident, but when the Kingsbury Run bodies started appearing a year later, many detectives privately feared they were dealing with a spree that had already been active for years. The killer was practicing, getting better, and testing the limits of police capability. The year 1936, the peak of the Cleveland Terror, saw a series of similar, unsolved torso murders in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, just a few hours' drive away. In July 1936, a headless, dismembered torso was found wrapped in blankets in a boxcar in Pittsburgh. The victim was never identified. More bodies, similarly sectioned and drained of blood, appeared throughout the late 1930s. The similarities were chilling. All victims were marginalized, the bodies were meticulously prepared, and there was no effort to conceal the bodies, only to conceal their identity. The killer seemed to be following the train routes and the industrial heartland that connected the two cities. The most compelling evidence that the killer remained free and active came 12 years after the official case went cold, and well after Eliot Ness had left Cleveland. In July 1950, a headless, dismembered body of a man named Robert Robertson was found in a boarding house in Cleveland, Ohio. Robertson had been dead for several months. His body had been subjected to the same clean dismemberment and the same chemical treatment to preserve the flesh. This victim was found indoors, in a dwelling, suggesting a possible shift in the killer's dumping tactics, or perhaps a change in their access to secure locations. The sheer precision and the identical MO convinced many veteran investigators that they were dealing with the same monster who had terrorized Kingsbury Run. If Robertson was a victim of the torso killer, then it means Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, the prime suspect, was likely not the killer, as he was institutionalized and under care. The killer was active for at least 16 years, from 1934 to 1950, and possibly operated across three major cities, Cleveland, Youngstown, and Pittsburgh. The shadow of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run stretches far beyond the city limits of Cleveland, transforming the case from a local tragedy into one of America's longest and most geographically expansive unsolved serial murder sprees. The question for modern investigators remains: was it one killer, or a terrifying copycat who mastered the original butcher's chilling craft?
Eliot Ness arrived in Cleveland as a titan. He was the man who had faced down the criminal empire of Al Capone and emerged victorious, an incorruptible symbol of justice. But he left Cleveland as a cautionary tale, his legendary career irreparably stained by the one case he could not solve: the Torso murders. For the public, the abrupt end to the murders in 1938, coupled with the mass burning of the shanty towns in Kingsbury Run, did not signal a clever investigative closure. It signaled failure. Ness's order to incinerate the shanties, the homes of the very poor people he had sworn to protect, was meant to be a dramatic show of force, clearing out the killer's potential nesting ground. Instead, it was widely viewed as a desperate, reckless, and deeply authoritarian act. It destroyed crucial potential evidence and alienated the public and the local press. The narrative shifted from Eliot Ness hunts a monster to Eliot Ness fails to protect the poor. The fact that Ness knew who the killer was, Dr. Sweeney, but could not secure an official indictment, was an unbearable humiliation. In the eyes of the public, the man who had outsmarted Capone had been outsmarted by a madman. The failure of the Torso case became a corrosive force in Ness's personal and professional life. The constant pressure, the endless media scrutiny, and the psychological torment of his clandestine interrogations with Sweeney led Ness to increase his reliance on alcohol, the very substance he had spent his youth fighting to prohibit. The years immediately following the investigation were marked by a series of low-profile humiliations. Political failure. Ness's political aspirations were crushed. He ran for mayor of Cleveland in 1947, but was overwhelmingly defeated. His image as the incorruptible crusader had been replaced by the weary, defeated policeman. The fateful accident. In 1942, while serving as director of public safety, Ness was involved in a serious drunken driving accident. He attempted to cover up his involvement, but the story eventually broke, and it ruined his reputation. The untouchable had become compromised. The marriage breakdown. His personal life mirrored his professional collapse. He went through several marriages, each one ending under the strain of his career, his drinking, and the trauma of the Torso investigation. The ghost of the Torso killer followed Ness for the rest of his life. He left Cleveland in 1947 and spent his remaining years moving between unsuccessful jobs, unable to recapture the glory of his youth. The irony of his legacy is profound. He is celebrated for taking down a gang of mobsters, but his greatest, most enduring challenge, a lone, sadistic serial killer, remained his greatest failure. In his last years, Ness co-authored the book, The Untouchables, a highly fictionalized account of his Chicago years, which briefly returned him to the limelight just before his death in 1957. He died a poor, largely forgotten man, never receiving the justice or recognition he sought for the Cleveland victims. But his last thoughts were often of Kingsbury Run. He never wavered in his belief that Dr. Francis E. Sweeney was the Mad Butcher, a man who, thanks to political constraints and lack of evidence, delivered the ultimate defeat to one of America's greatest crime fighters.
The investigators of the 1930s were severely limited by the forensic technology of their time. Today, modern forensic science and psychological profiling offer a chillingly clear portrait of the killer and the reasons for his success. Modern profiling, based on the FBI Behavioral Science Unit model, classifies the Torso killer as an organized sexual sadist with high intelligence. The evidence for this is drawn entirely from his actions.
organized. The killer's methods were meticulous. The methodical disposal, the systematic cleanup, the use of chemicals, and his apparent movement between cities all point to a highly organized individual. He planned his attacks, had access to a secure kill site, and transported the bodies carefully. High intelligence, the surgical precision of the dismemberment, often occurring neatly at the joints, indicated mastery of anatomy. His success in evading capture for years further proved a keen awareness of police procedure. The killer was likely educated in a medical, veterinarian, or related field. Ritualistic, the systematic removal of the head and the occasional emasculation of male victims fulfilled a deep personal psychological need for ultimate control over the victim's identity and life. Modern analysis highlights the critical errors and environmental factors that allowed the killer to succeed. First, the killer's target selection was his genius. By preying exclusively on low-visibility victims, the transients, vagrants, and sex workers who were unlikely to be missed or thoroughly investigated in the chaotic environment of the Great Depression, he built in a major forensic barrier. Second, the technological gap was insurmountable. The absence of DNA analysis, trace evidence protocols, and advanced fingerprinting meant the killer's main tactic, destroying identification by removing heads and hands, was impossible for the 1930s police to overcome. Finally, the jurisdictional chaos greatly aided the killer. The intense rivalry between Eliot Ness's city police and the county sheriff, coupled with the lack of communication across state lines, Ohio, Pennsylvania, allowed the killer to easily move and exploit the gaps between jurisdictions, frustrating any chance of a coordinated pursuit. The torso killer was not merely lucky. He was hyper-competent and operated in a perfect storm of social neglect and technological limitation. He defined the modern serial killer prototype before the world even had a name for it.
The investigators of the 1930s, Ness, Murillo, and the rest, were brilliant men, but they were operating without the benefit of the organized, scientifically backed profiling that exists today. The term serial killer had not even been coined. Today, looking back at the evidence, the Cleveland torso killer, or killers, fits the profile of a highly organized, ritualistic, and power-driven sexual sadist, one whose primary motivation was the ultimate, cold-blooded act of control over his victims. The killer's MO paints a chilling psychological profile. The need for dehumanization. The removal of the heads was paramount. In psychological terms, the killer was not just erasing evidence, he was removing the victim's identity. Decapitation is the ultimate act of dehumanization, reducing a human being to a mere piece of meat or an anatomical specimen. The ritual of cleaning. The careful draining and cleaning of the bodies suggests a fastidious, almost ceremonial aspect to the murder. This indicates a deeply held compulsion and ritual separate from the act of murder itself. The killer likely spent considerable time with the bodies in a secure, private location. The superiority complex. The killer was profoundly arrogant. By leaving the bodies in public yet unsolved, he was actively engaging in a game of wits with the police, particularly Eliot Ness. The taunting nature of the dump sites, often near official buildings, reinforces a narcissistic feeling of superiority. From a modern forensic perspective, the killer's success lay in three critical tactical decisions. Target selection. By preying exclusively on the transient and marginalized population of Kingsbury Run, the people society had already forgotten. The killer ensured that the chance of witnesses, detailed missing persons reports, or swift, high-priority investigations was minimal. Destruction of identity. The decapitation and removal of the hands, which carried fingerprints, made it impossible to identify in the pre-DNA era. This was the single most effective barrier to solving the case. No name,
no case. Anatomical knowledge. The surgical precision was key. It allowed him to work quickly and cleanly. The medical skill gave him the confidence to carry out the acts and the knowledge to eliminate forensic evidence. The final mystery remains, was it one killer or two? Theory A, the lone monster. Dr. Francis E. Sweeney was the killer from 1934 to 1938. The 1950 murder of Robert Robertson was a rare, skilled copycat who had studied the original crimes. Or Sweeney was released and struck again before being permanently silenced. Theory B, the mobile killer. The killer was a skilled individual, but perhaps not Sweeney, who was not institutionalized and whose spree spanned 16 years and the three industrial cities, Cleveland, Youngstown, and Pittsburgh. This profile suggests a drifter with medical or butchering skills who used the railway and the Depression-era chaos as his cover. In the end, the Cleveland torso killer remains a specter of American true crime, a figure who leveraged the misery and chaos of the Great Depression to commit acts of unthinkable cruelty. He did not achieve the international notoriety of Jack the Ripper, but his savagery was unmatched, and his victory over Eliot Ness ensures his place as one of the most terrifying, elusive shadows in the nation's criminal history. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run remains America's most forgotten and most successful serial killer.
The Cleveland torso murders are not merely a cold case. They are an open wound in the history of American law enforcement. For decades, the only known victims were Edward Andrassy, Florence Polillo, and tentatively Rose Wallace. The rest were names erased by the killer's knife. 10 souls known only by numbers or macabre nicknames like the Tattooed Man. Almost 90 years after the terror of Kingsbury Run, modern science stepped in to finish the job that Eliot Ness could not. In the 2020s, the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office partnered with the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit organization specializing in using investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique that helped catch the Golden State Killer, to identify unidentified remains. The goal was simple, yet profound: to give the forgotten victims their names back. The process was arduous. The bodies, buried in unmarked graves in the city cemetery, were severely decomposed after nearly a century. In 2024, the Medical Examiner's Office announced the exhumation of 2 key victims: Kingsbury Run John Doe No. 4, the Tattooed Man, and Kingsbury Run John Doe No. 6. Sophisticated new techniques were required to extract usable DNA from the degraded bone samples. The Tattooed Man, the most famous of the unidentified victims, the Tattooed Man, was buried with 6 distinctive tattoos on his body, including the names Helen and Paul. Now, genetic genealogists are building a family tree from his DNA, hoping to find a distant relative who can provide the final link to his identity. The torso killer may have robbed these people of their lives and their identities, but DNA science promises to thwart the killer's ultimate act of dehumanization. If the victims are identified, a new chapter will begin, a search for living descendants, a final chance to understand who they were and why they were in Kingsbury Run. While there is virtually no hope of finding the killer's DNA on the remains after so many decades, identifying the victims is a moral victory. Eliot Ness was haunted by the fact that he failed to stop the killer, but perhaps the true failure was society's willingness to forget the victims. The ongoing work of the DNA Doe Project ensures that the final, lasting legacy of the Cleveland torso murders will not be the terror of the killer, nor the failure of the lawman, but the restoration of human dignity to the forgotten souls of Kingsbury Run.